So in this video, we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the basics of doing programmatic design and doing programmatic layout given a design from scratch. And so we're going to basically try to create an entire screen and avoid using storyboard altogether. So we'll start with this basic screen, and this is basically any screen that you can use. So we use Sketch to design a screen for some sort of like food delivery or restaurant app, and we're going to create this from scratch using only programmatic layout. So one thing that we've talked about before is the fact that layout can be done in two ways, one being using frames and one using constraints. Constraints pretty much work the same way as you would do on storyboard by setting individual constraints. And frames can cut down a lot on the lines of code, but it does tend to be a little bit more involved in terms of mathematical calculation. So let's go ahead and get started here. I already have an Xcode project started, and I've done a couple of things. So first, I added all of the images that I'll need to the assets folder, and I've also imported all the fonts that I want. So here we're using the San Francisco font, which is a really popular one for iOS these days, and it's probably something that you might use at some point. I'll say that doing fonts in terms of adding fonts to your project is actually a little bit more tedious than you might think. So definitely spend some time looking this up and trying to figure out how to add fonts correctly if you've never done this before. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. I have a storyboard file with just a single view controller. I haven't edited anything on this. So we're going to try to do everything on view controller if we can on the code programmatically. So let's start by going from the bottom and working our way up through all the features. We see that the view itself, the entire screen, is filled with a background view that's actually a slightly off shade of blue, like bluish white. So let's go ahead and set this as our background color. And we'll see that the RGB value for this is 238, 242, 245. So we'll set that here. We'll change the view's background color equal to UI color, and we'll pass in an RGB value. So this is 238 over 255, and these should be decimal values, so they always have to end in being divided by 255. And we'll set the alpha to 1. Okay, so at this point we should have an empty screen with a slightly off shade of white. Next thing that we might want to do is to take care of this image, the Panda Express. So we see that this image basically fills up the entire first half of the screen, but it's a little bit under an entire half. It's a little bit short, so I'm going to say this is about 40%, and so I'll design our frame that way. So let's create, first of all, I don't want to fill up the view to load function with too much stuff, so I'm going to make a separate function for UI. And I'll call set UI here. So now we can create an image view, and we'll pass in a frame for this. And the frame basically takes in an x, y, width, and height as parameters. So x and y, the origin corresponds to 0, 0, which is right here at the very top left. So I want this to start at the origin and take up this much space. So let's start at 0, 0. We'll say the width is the width of the entire frame. And the height will be view.frame.height times 0.4. We can also set the image for the image view to be equal to, we'll call it Panda Express. And one thing to note is that before Swift 3, images had to be referred by calling UI image named, and you pass in a string as a parameter. In Xcode 8, it actually doesn't require you to do that. You're actually able to refer to images directly from the assets folder, which is really cool because it prevents potential typos. So we'll do that. One more thing I'll do is to set the content mode for this, just because we want to prevent it from getting distorted. So I'm going to set the content mode here to scale aspect fill. And lastly, we'll add this to the subview, as a subview to the view. So let's go ahead and try running this. So when we run this, we should basically see a screen with just the image at the top. And it will look a little bit something like this. Cool, so we have the image filling this up here. And now the next thing we need to do is fill the rest of the views up on the bottom half of the screen. So let's take a look here again on the sketch file. So we see that there's two independent looking sections here. And what we could do is basically just create all of this within the code and the view controller as well. But we notice that we can do a little bit of abstraction here by moving away the code for what goes inside the views away from this and just keeping these as two separate views that we create. So what I'm going to do is to actually create a separate class here. So I'll make two classes, one for the top section here and another one here. So let's call the first one description view, and make sure it's a subclass of UIView. And we see here that it takes in three different things. One is an image for the logo, the name of the restaurant, and also another label for content. So I'm going to create three parameters here. We'll say logo is a UI image, name is a string, and content is a string as well. Cool. So now what we can do is we want to be able to initialize this class, or this view, with all the parameters that we need. So it'll be a little bit similar to this in the case of the UI image view, but in this case we're going to pass in a frame as well as three parameters for the logo, name, and content. So I'll create init, we'll pass in a frame, CGRect, we'll pass in a logo, name, and content string. And the frame, I don't want to worry about having to set anything with the frame, so I'll just go ahead and call the parent function for this, which is just super.init frame. And now I can do the rest of the stuff here. So I'll set the logo. I'll say self.logo equals logo, self.name equals name, and self.content equals content. And the last thing I want to do in this function is to make sure this view is white on its own. So we want to make sure that it doesn't blend into the background, which is slightly off-white. So I'm going to change the background color here to just white. Cool, and that's all we need to do there. You'll notice right now that this is complaining because we haven't implemented the required init function, which you need when you initialize a view. Don't worry too much about this. It's just something that we need to have. So one more thing I'm going to do is to start setting the layout for all of these three parameters. So I'm going to make a new function called setLayout. And I'll make sure I call it here as well. And this is going to be where we actually set the layout for the entire view. So first thing we want to do, let's take care of the logo. If we look back on the sketch file, we see that the logo is basically a very small square-shaped image that we have just off of the top left corner. So I'm going to say let logo view equal UI image view, and we'll pass in a frame. And so the frame, we can have a margin of about 10 from the top left. So I'll pass in 10 and 10 as the X and Y. The width, we want to be roughly square-shaped, and usually you want to avoid having actual constant values because it doesn't really take care of different screen sizes. And so typically you want your values to be in terms of like a fraction of the width or the height. In this case, this image is really small, so I'm just going to go ahead and make it 40 by 40. Other things that we can set here, we'll set the image equal to logo. We'll set, actually that should be pretty much everything we need here. So I can go ahead and add this as a sub view as well. Okay, now let's take care of the name. So if you look back at the name, in terms of positioning this, we want this to be just a little bit off from the logo, and also we want it to be centered vertically with the logo. So what we'll do is we'll say let name label equal UI label, and for the frame here, we want the X position to be 10 off from the right edge of the image. So if we do the math here, we see that there's a margin of 10, a width of 40, and then another margin of 10. So we want the X to start at 60. And with the Y, this is going to be a little bit difficult to follow, but the image has a height of 40, and there's also a margin of 10. And so basically the middle of the image is 20 in, so 20 within the image plus 10 here is a height of 30, right? But we want this to be not starting at 30 because that will be the top left here. So we want the middle of the label to be corresponding to 30. So let's say that our label itself has a height of 30, which means we want the top 15 to be above the 30. So we're going to set the Y here to just be 15. And the width we can say is arbitrary. We'll just say 200 here because it should be a pretty small label. We're going to set the text to name. We'll set the font as well to the SF font, and we'll also see on the sketch file that this is bolded. So we can say nameLabel.font equals UI font, and we'll pass in a name and a size. So the name will be SF UI text dash bold. and the size we'll say is 14. That should be enough. We can go ahead and add that as a subview as well. Now let's do the content label. So we'll create another one called content label. And for the frame here, pretty similar. We want the very left of this label to align with the left of the image. So this is 10, so this will also be 10. The width should be the entire width of the view minus 10 here and 10 here for each margin, so minus 20. And then we want the height, the Y position, to be 10 off from the bottom of the image. So what we'll do here is we'll say 10 for X. We want this to be equal to 10 for the margins for each side of the image, and then the height, so this will be a total of 60. The width will be frame.width minus 20, and the height will be frame.height. We want to subtract the 60 of the margin from the image, and we also want to subtract 10 on the bottom for another margin there, so we'll make this minus 70. Okay, content label.text we'll set equal to content. Couple interesting things we'll need to do here. We want to make this a multiple line label. Oops, this should be content. So we can set the number of lines here, and we'll make it 4. We can set the line break mode, and we'll set this to dot by truncating tail, which means that at the very end of the string we'll end in a series of ellipses if it goes on too long. And one more thing that we want to do is this label may not necessarily start at the top left. It's actually centered vertically within the entire label, but we don't want any additional space on top of the label in case this label, in case the height we set was too big. So we want it to actually be contained within the smallest size possible so that it keeps aligned at the top. So we're going to call another function here called size to fit, which will basically constrain the text within the smallest possible label size that we need, but still keep the constraints that we need. So with all of that done, let's go ahead and add this as a subview as well. Great, and that should be all we need to do here. Set layout is done, and we've set the entire init function for description view. So now we can go ahead and add this as another view within our view controller. So what I'll do here is I'll say let description view equal, and we'll call this init function that we created. So for the frame, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and modify it a little bit. We want the frame to start with a little margin, so I'll say 10 here for X. We want the Y to be about, looks like 20 off of the bottom of the top image. So I'm going to say view.frame.height times 0.4, which is the image itself, but then we'll add 20 to it for a margin. The width we can set equal to view.frame.width minus 20. And the height, I think, in this case, about 0.25 should be good. Now for the logo, we can pass in the logo that we have from the assets file. The name we'll say is Panda Express. And the content, I'm just going to copy this. So with that done, we can add this as a subview to the view. Cool. So let's try running this. So we should end up seeing this view created separately within the screen. Great, that looks good. This view is created. We have all the parameters that we need. It looks a little bit different from what we have in the sketch file. So we can make a couple of adjustments to this just to make sure that everything looks nice. I'm just going to change the content label's font because right now it's regular, so let's go ahead and make it light instead. And we'll see what happens there. So let's set the content label's font. Same thing, but this time we'll make it SFUI text-light, and we'll use size 14 again. And if we run this, we should see something that looks pretty similar. Yep, that looks much better. So this view is done. Now we can go ahead and take a look at the other view, which is this view with 3 images. So let's create a separate class here, which will be pretty similar to the description view, but I'll call this one meal image view. Again, a subclass of UIView. And here we need 3 different images, so I'm going to make image 1, image 2, and image 3. And in our init, we can take a frame and also take 3 images. So we'll do the same thing here. We'll call super.init on the frame. And then for the rest of these, we'll set image1 equal to, or self.image1 to image1, self.image2 equals image2, and self.image3 equals image3. Again, we want to set the background color here to white. And we're going to create a separate function. First I'll implement the required one. Here we'll call setLayout, and now we can set the properties for these 3 images as well. Okay, so what do we want to do here? So we have 3 images. We want them to be roughly square-shaped, and we want to have a margin between each of them. So let's start with the first one. And what I'm going to do here is, I noticed that these 3 images are very similar, and so they have very similar properties, so it would be a little bit redundant to make different image views for each of them. So I'm just going to make a for loop and then create the image view each time with similar properties, but just shift the x position every time. So let's start with an x position of about 10. And then we want to do a for loop 3 times. We'll create an image view. And for the frame, we'll pass in our current x as the x position. For the y, each time it'll be about the same margin away. And I think we'll make this 20 instead of 10, just to look a bit nicer. So we'll make this 20 every time. The width, we want to be, we're going to have to do some math here. So we notice that the width of the screen should be roughly 1/3 of the view, but subtracting the margins as well. So we have margins of 20 each time, so 20, 40, 60, 80. So we want to subtract 80 from the width and then divide that by 3 to get the view, the width of each image. So we're going to do frame.width minus 80, and then divide it by 3. And we want the height to be the same thing as the width, so I'm just going to copy this over. Cool. So we've created the frame for the image view. Next thing that we can do, let's add this as a subview. And we'll adjust our current x. And we're going to add the margin of 20 plus the width of the original image. So we'll do, let's copy this over. And to this we'll add 20. So what happens here? Oh, we need to set current x to be a CG float instead of an integer, so this doesn't complain. Okay, cool. I'll add working wrapping here. So that should fix all of the bugs. So now that we have this done, we can go ahead and try to create a view for this as well. And we'll do something similar. We'll copy this frame. We'll keep the x position the same at 10. The y this time will be not times 0.4, but if you see here, we added 0.4 for the image, 0.25 for this, so a total of 0.65, plus margins of 20 each time. So what we want to do here is make this times 0.65 and add 40. For the width, we can keep it the same, and for the height, we'll make this 0.2. For each of the three images, I'm just going to pass in the same one here for simplicity. It's called Panda Express Meal. And let's add this as a subview. Now let's take a look. So this didn't work because we didn't set the image. And what we need to do here is because we're doing a for loop, we don't know which of the three images we're using. So I'm going to use a ternary conditional here to specify which image we want based on what I is. So if I equals 0, we want to use image 1. Otherwise, if I equals 1, we'll use image 2, or else we'll use image 3. So let's try this again. Great, and that looks pretty much exactly like what we want. Very roughly similar. So now there's a few more things we need to do. First of all, if you notice on the sketch file, each of these views has a little bit of shadow, just to make it look nicer and stand out more. So we're going to add some shadows to these cells. So what we can do is, within the view controller, for each of these views, we can add some properties to them. So we'll say description view dot layer dot shadow color equals UI color dot black color, and then we want to call the CG color for this in terms of setting shadows for layers. A couple more things we can do. We can set the shadow opacity. We'll say 0.2 because we want to keep it pretty light. We'll also do shadow offset, which basically specifies how we want our shadow to be positioned and like what the direction should be. So we can say CG size, and we'll pass in a width and a height. And we'll say the width is 0, but we want the height to be 1, so meaning a height of 1 for the shadow. Last thing, we can also set the radius, and we'll also make this pretty small. We'll make it 2. I'm going to copy this over and do the same thing for the image view as well. Okay, so if we run this now, we should see the same thing, but each of the views should have a little bit of shadow added on the bottom. Cool, and you can see the little shadow. So we're almost done here. The last thing that we need to do that we've been missing out is you see here there's a little bit of a navigation bar, and this is a custom navigation bar where we use a gradient as the background. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go to my storyboard, and the one thing I'm going to do is just embed this view controller within a navigation controller. And that's all we need to do in the storyboard file. And I could just edit the navigation bar within the view controller, but this looks like a navigation style that might be consistent if we were doing this across the entire app. So I'm actually going to edit this within the app delegate so that it's consistent across every navigation bar if we had multiple screens. So let's do a couple of things here. We want to set the image background for the navigation bar. So we'll do navigation bar.appearance, and we'll set the background image. And what we can do is pass in an image, and we can also pass in an option for the bar metric. So first we want the image. So I'll say let nav image equal, I think it was right there, gradient nav bar. So I'll pass in nav image, and this will be for .default. And one more thing we want to do is to make sure that the tint color, which basically refers to the color for all of the things that are placed on top of this navigation bar, are white. So I'm going to set the tint color to this to white. And let's try running this really quick. We haven't actually placed a back button on here yet, but we can do that next and see what happens. Cool, so now we have the gradient overlaid on top. If you look really closely here, you'll see that there's a little bit of a black outline here on the bottom of the navigation bar, which doesn't look really good. It kind of shows that there's a border to the navigation bar, which we don't want. We want it to fade in nicely. So what we're going to do is add one more line here. And we'll say .shadow image. And we'll set this equal to an empty UI image. And what that will basically do is set an empty shadow so that we don't have any sort of outline that shows up. And we can see it goes away. So navigation bar is set. Now the only thing that we have left to do is to set a back button here, and we'll have it equal to this arrow. So let's go back to our view controller, and we'll add one more line. So we're going to say navigation item dot left bar button item, and we're going to set it equal to UI bar button item, and we'll pass in an image with the style. So we'll call this, and we can say the image is left arrow for style dot plane. We can set the target to self, and we don't really need to do anything here since we're just doing the design, so I'll just set the action to null. So now we can run this, and we should see a white arrow show up. Great, so now we have a back button as well that's added on. And now let's take a look and compare our sketch file to our simulator. And this pretty much looks like exactly what we want. We have all the features that we need. Looks nicely laid out. And on the bright side, we've done all of this without even touching storyboard. So this is pretty much the entire process of doing programmatically. Again, we did everything with frames here, but this could also be done entirely using constraints as well. But that would add a few more lines of code. So yeah, that's pretty much the basics of it. That's how you should go about doing programmatic layout. Okay, thanks guys.